Our hope is that this is inspirational as well as super practical, that people can take away these ideas on how to make change in large organizations. So with that, thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to be here, Jody. Thank you for the introduction. It's an honor to speak with everybody here today. Thanks for taking a minute out of your time today. It's my first time speaking as civilian Jess. I retired 3 weeks ago. And so I got the red nails, the red lipstick. So I'm kind of enjoying it, but I miss it too. So thank you for letting me speak today. Our Air Force, like the other services, was originally built around one type of person. And although today's Air Force is more inclusive, we still have many legacy barriers that we need to overcome. Today, these barriers are not of a nefarious nature. Often we don't even know that these barriers exist, which is why if we don't actively seek to understand culture and gender differences, they will remain hidden. Let me share with you one example of a legacy barrier. Previously, the minimum standing height of 5'4" to become an Air Force pilot eliminates 44% of the US female population between the ages of 20 and 29. Now compare that to 3.7% of men. But you don't just get measured for your standing height, you also get measured for your sitting height, which is 34 inches. And because of that, it impacts minority women. 74% of Black women, 72% of Hispanic women, and 61% of Asian females cannot become a pilot because of the sitting height. Those are pretty staggering numbers. So when different ethnicities have different body compositions, and you design an aircraft only using a Caucasian body type using a 1967 anthropometric survey, you disadvantage those who fall outside the ethnicity. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail later about anthropometrics, but first let's discuss why we should care. Our national defense strategy tells us that for decades, the United States has enjoyed uncontested dominant superiority in every operating domain. But today, every domain is contested: air, land, sea, space, cyberspace. As China develops as a strategic opponent, another competition has emerged: talent competition. By 2030, China will have 4 times the population of the United States and 15 times the number of STEM graduates as us. And they will likely double our GDP. China's growing numbers combined with their ongoing academic reforms place them at an advantage to leverage their human capital. And as China grows, the US struggles to find quality recruits. In 2018, the DoD released a report stating that 71% of young adults in the US are ineligible to serve in the military due to health, fitness, or educational factors. To maintain the military's lethality, the US needs to modernize its capabilities to attract and retain talent to hold on to a competitive advantage. To compete with China's human capital of 1 to 4 to ours, each one of our pilots and airmen must be that much better. Simply put, we cannot afford to continue to drown in self-imposed barriers. Failure to do so will result in our inability to remain a strategic competitor. The Department of Air Force's Women's Initiative Team, the WIT, is part of the Air Force's Barrier Analysis Working Group. Our mission is to advocate for policy changes to remove barriers for women's propensity to serve with active duty, guard, civilian, reserve. We are not trained specialists or a select few within the Pentagon. The WIT isn't a special organization that has special access to the Chief of Staff. We are your everyday airmen that have a passion to serve others and use research and data to tell a story. Often we are hit hard by what I like to call the frozen middle. Often the path to some of our toughest initiatives, like the new hair policy change that allows women to wear a ponytail or long braids, was a long journey met with lots of frustration. Often the solutions to our most complicated problems come from our airmen and not always our senior leaders. As leaders, we need to listen, encourage, coach, and empower our airmen to get their ideas to the right decision makers. Senior leaders must continue to hold their commands accountable, to expedite innovative changes while accepting reasonable risk to ensure an accelerated solution. The current process is outdated. New innovative methods must be embraced. And that's how we've always done it. Mentality needs to be crushed out of the system. Complacency is the enemy of innovation. Innovation will secure global dominance. So now with you, I would like to share 5 things that the WIT does that makes us successful, and to talk about some of our accomplishments and hope that you could take away something from this. So let's get started. So the first one of the 5, and I think is the most important one, is look beyond the numbers. So what do I mean by look beyond the numbers? When anecdotal evidence directly contradicts the data being presented, we need to ask additional questions. Are we measuring the right things? Are we asking the right questions? Here's 2 examples. The first one, let me ask you, can captains attend squadron officer schools during pregnancy? We kept hearing stories about captains being denied exceptions to policy to attend SOS during pregnancy. We reached out to the school and they confirmed with us that they approved almost all the ETPs. So is there a problem, or are these stories of disapproval just one-off? To gather more data, we turned to crowdsourcing through social media, such as the Women's Officer Forum, the Wolfpack, on Facebook that has over 12,000 members. And from there, we found over 20 captains in a given period that were denied applying for an ETP at the squadron and group level. So how do you measure something that hasn't been applied for? So why were these commanders not allowing women to apply for ETPs? Well, we found that the majority of reasons, there was strong maternal bias and uninformed decision making happening. Here are some of the typical responses. You can't go to SOS because you can't be DG and because you can't participate in all the events, or you won't be able to fool up around and you'll hold your flight back. Or my personal favorite is, I just don't think it'd be a good idea for you to go. Your baby is more important. So we took this information to A1, which governs the series for PME, and we were able to change the policy to separate pregnancy from injuries and stated that you can volunteer to go to SSS as long as you have your doctor's permission. Now, my second case about the data, let's go back to the height waivers we're talking about. So there is a height waiver process to try to mitigate this. So the Chief of Staff of the Air Force at the time was General Goldfein. He stood up a rated diversity board and came up with a strategy to increase the low numbers of women and minorities in aviation. Women at the time only made up 5% of pilots, and overall the officer career field for aviation was 8%. Now compare that to the officer corps at 21%. Why weren't there more female aviators? Are women just not interested in flying? Well, we were hearing from the field that women were too short to fly. So we presented that as one possible reason that the standing height requirement eliminates 44% of the US female population. This would significantly decrease the number of women eligible to become pilots, navigators, air battle managers, CSOs. Because they were designed, like we said, an aircraft using only a Caucasian study. But later the Air Force created a height waiver as a way to overcome this legacy barrier. So here's the conversation that I observed. This was the Chief of Staff of General Goldfein. He asked the question to the board, what is the approval rate for height waivers for women? AETC's response was, sir, I approve every waiver that comes across my desk. So is there a problem with height waivers? Or are these stories being too short to fly just another one off? Go back and listen to the response. Sir, I approve every waiver that comes across my desk. When anecdotal evidence directly contradicts the data, ask, are we measuring the correct things? And are we asking the right question? What was actually happening was women were not applying for the waiver because they didn't know it existed. Studies have proven that women are significantly less likely to apply for a job if they don't perceive themselves as 100% qualified. So when you Google, how tall do I have to be an Air Force pilot, and it simply states 64 inches with no mention of a waiver, they don't think it's an option. We found out through our research that women are relatively uninformed about the waiver, and often the cadre at their commissioning source is too. Almost half our pipeline comes from over 140 ROTC detachments. We reached out to these 15 different of these ROTC detachments and asked their cadre about height requirements. Based on their cadet waiving process guide that they use, most didn't even know what to do or if a waiver was available. So how do we fix this? First, we had to rebrand the waiver for the officers so that individuals would stop self-eliminating when they read the standard that stated you had to be between 64 and 77 inches to fly. And we rephrased it to say, if you are outside these measurements, the height requirements will vary by operational platform and additional measurements will be required and will be paired to an aircraft. And even though we changed the source of the document in the medical regulation, which we know no one reads, we had to work with the recruiting services to change our websites and to start a media plan that would circumvent the hundreds of other search engine hits that didn't mention the waiver or additional measurements, to include our own ROTC cadet medical processing guides. So look beyond the numbers. When anecdotal evidence directly contradicts the data being presented, we need to ask additional questions. So that brings me to number 2. Bring data to tell a compelling story, or as I like to call it, why should you care? Often diversity is treated as a luxury we can't afford during fiscal restraints. For the career enlisted aviator, unlike the officer system that had an evaluation performed on aircraft to create a waiver system to get a few more women in the door, there was no study done to determine a safe waiver process for the enlisted. A career field in the career enlisted aviator that has 10% women, something we could have easily measured back in 2002 when we created the process for officers. These career enlisted aviators are composed of over 15,000 airmen in 10 specialties, such as loadmasters, boom operators, flight attendants, and even sensory operators on remotely piloted aircraft. We went to the Undersecretary of Acquisitions, which was Dr. Roper at the time, and we went into his office and asked for $4.5 million given to us in a period of over 2 years to correctly measure these crew positions. So how do we justify this request for funding from the WIT? Because it's the right thing to do? Why would he give us this money when he can't afford to even fully fund defensive systems on our aircraft like LAIRCOM? We had to turn this into a business case analysis. Here is where you bring your data to tell a compelling story. And here is a small example of the story that we brought that day. One of the 10 enlisted career field aviators fields that don't have a waiver is called an airborne cryptological language analyst. They're essentially a flying linguist who intercept sensitive messages of our strategic opponents like Chinese Mandarin during flight. These linguists only have a physical requirement to safely fly to evacuate the aircraft as any other passenger would, yet they are held to the same standards of the minimum of 5'4" as the pilots who fly the aircraft. A few years ago, the Air Force could not recruit enough academically qualified candidates to become a flying linguist. As a result, the career field is significantly undermanned. In order to solve this problem, they opted to lower the minimum academic scores to determine a candidate's ability to learn a new language. As a result, the career field is now fully manned, but the program's attrition rate is dramatically increased, costing the Air Force a significant amount of money in the millions. To put it plainly, we made a decision to accept that our linguist abilities are getting worse, rather than lowering or eliminating an arbitrary height restriction that has no impact on their ability to fly. We could have filled these undermanned career fields with members who had the highest scores on the aptitude test, yet we accepted mediocrity. This is a great example of the negative consequences that can happen when you restrict a large portion of our recruiting pool based on an artificial standard. The cost of that one aircraft evaluation to create a waiver would have only cost the Air Force $125,000. The basic cost to pay for one enlisted airman to become a basic linguist is $250,000. The Air Force is not taking risk in the right areas. We are wasting money and talent. So we walked out of that meeting, and with the decision to obligate the funding for the anthropometrics lab, thanks to Chief Dawson and Jennifer Whitestone and many other members in the team. And a few months later, they started measuring aircraft, and they're currently updating the enlisted waiver system as we speak today. So bring your data to tell a compelling story. So this brings me to number 3 of 5. Red team everything. Not only do you need to know your argument, you need to know the counter argument of those that will disagree with your proposal. You do not have to have consensus when trying to make institutional change. You only need to convince the stakeholders that own the policy. To do this, you have to be the smartest person or team in the room about the subject, ready for the frozen middle. For the recent hair policy changes allowing female airmen to wear their hair down in a single braid, double braid, or ponytail, which I like to call the Free the Bun movement, was met with great resistance. Knowing the counter argument and getting ahead of it by delivering supporting data was crucial before we met the board. The team conducted surveys of thousands of servicewomen, provided feedback about the Air Force hair regulations. Respondents largely considered the current policy discriminatory, especially of those of African American and Native American descent. Roughly 68,000 active duty and 39,000 Air National Guard and Reserve airmen were impacted by hair standards, with a disproportionate impact towards ethnic airmen who had a different hair type. Of the over 10,000 survey respondents, 93% of female airmen and guardians agreed that the hair policy for females in the Air and Space Force needed to be updated. 52% referenced headaches and migraines due to the hair policies. Servicewomen experienced receding hairlines, bald spots, hair thinning, reduced growth, better known as traction alopecia. Many also experienced migraines, hair breakage, scalp sensitivity, soreness, and even moldy hair by putting up the bun when it was wet. Data also showed a higher rate of alopecia and hair loss among female active duty members when compared to civilians within the military healthcare system. Military equipment was not even designed for the bun. And so women only had a couple options to cut their hair short or to make your gas mask, your helmet, your night vision goggles to fit properly, or worse, not wear the equipment properly at all. In addition to that, we went around to advocate for support before meeting the board, and the team briefed MAGCOM commanders to solicit letters of support to present. My favorite counter argument in this entire process was from Major Aaliyah Nadeem, when a senior leader who took her meeting about the hair stated, "I can't help but notice you only have one female 4-star that signed a letter of support." In which Major Nadeem replied, "Sir, there is only one female 4-star in the Air Force." So, red team everything and be ready for that frozen medal because it's coming. Number 4, think big. Don't limit solving a problem by what is currently possible, but rather imagine a solution from a world without constraints and then work it backwards. So start big, don't limit yourself. Earlier, we spoke about barriers about pregnant airmen to send that could attend SOS. At this point, we started seeing a trend in our own initiatives that centered around pregnancy and maternal bias. For those of you that don't know what maternal bias is, it's the incorrect perception that women who are pregnant or have small children are less competent or committed to their career. As a result, they often encounter microaggressions and receive less opportunities to compete for competitive jobs and promotions. As the WIT addressed individual initiatives from lactation rooms, maternity flight suits, to caregiver leave, we discovered that 45 years after women were discharged from the military because of pregnancy discrimination policies still did not apply to active duty women. For context, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 amended the Civil Rights Act to make pregnancy discrimination a form of illegal sex discrimination. This law does not always apply uniformly to the military. Although DoD non-discrimination protections mirror other categories of the Civil Rights Act, such as race, color, gender, sex, it omits pregnancy to its military member is a glaring omission. What message are we sending in our policies about pregnant service members? While the WIT was still modernizing policies with its AFIs line by line, we went for a more strategic approach to advocate that the Department of Defense recognize pregnancy as a protected class. We developed a strategy along with presenting a copious amount of research to Air Force leaders, spoke on committees, and wrote articles. Fast forward September 4th, 2020, the Department of Defense updated the Military Equal Opportunity Program, DoD Instruction 1350-02, to include pregnancy as a protected class. So, always think big. Number 5, and this is my last one. We need a mechanism that can withstand the test of time. When developing a process or a policy, you need to set it up in a way that will be self-perpetuating mechanism as people and administrations change out. There have been countless initiatives that have flamed out as soon as the spore of a senior leader left. Once you have a mechanism that works, you also need from time to time to go back and inspect that mechanism to see if it needs any adjustments, kind of like the height waiver. During our journey for enlisted and officer height waivers, we uncovered more data. While the waiver was a quick and overt solution, it did not resolve the problem of ensuring the most qualified individuals are piloting the most advanced aircraft in the world. Waivers only masked the underlying issue and masqueraded as a substantial solution. For example, even with a waiver, the F-15 only accommodates 8.9% of females. The B-52, 14%. A-10, 28.9% of females are ineligible due to stature limitations. Most of these waivered individuals can't even fly a fighter, a career field that only has 2 to 3% women and historically generates the greatest number of senior leaders at the highest echelons within the Air Force, going back to the 4-star comment. Mobility aircraft is slightly more better, but the C-130 and C-17 still eliminate 1 out of 3 women compared to the staggering small number of 1 to 2% of men. So will this disproportionate standard be the same for the next inter-theater airlift or the next gen fighter? It is understandable and logical not to use female demographics in legacy aircraft designed before women were permitted to fly in combat in 1993. However, data standards are still being used today, 27 years later, such as the F-35. The F-35 eliminated approximately 55% of females due to historical engineering constraints. When the Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition was informed of his lack of accommodation, he directed the development of a solution that would permit at least 80%, still accepting that 1 out of 5 women would be eliminated. However, after congressional pressure, the human system integration standards were changed to develop an aircraft that accommodated 97% of women, and that is the standard today. Congress should not be the mechanism that ensures that we are designing aircraft to be inclusive for the population in which we recruit from. The mechanism should start with a requirement within the Air Force itself. So we went back to acquisitions and Dr. Roper, and on July 31st of 2020, he signed into policy that Air Force will use the central 95th percentile of the entire recruiting population for all future acquisitions in aircraft flight equipment and aircraft design. So build a process, policy, and mechanism that gets at the heart and the root of the issue. So in conclusion, I encourage you to look beyond the numbers when anecdotal evidence directly contradicts the data being presented and investigate further. Once you discover the root cause of a problem, bring data to tell a compelling story to win over the stakeholders and be ready to counter the frozen middle. Think big with your solution. Don't limit by what you think is currently possible, but rather imagine a solution from a world without constraints and work it backwards from there. And finally, when you have the supportive leadership to implement a solution, make sure you're putting in place the proper mechanisms so that it can stand the test of time. As the Air Force takes another giant step forward and begins implementing these new policies, we must embrace General Brown's vision that we must accelerate, change, or lose. After all, our democracy depends on it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jess. We have time for questions. And if you're watching the recording, if you're watching on Zoom right now, you're welcome to type your questions into chat or raise your hand and we will unmute you and let you ask your question. But are there any questions here in the room for Jess?
I have one. I'm here. I'm sorry. Jess, can you tell us what's next for you? What's your next move, or what are you advocating for now, if that is your desire?
Well, I do have a day job now, but I still hustle for the WIT and as a civilian now. So we have 2 pieces of legislation that we're trying to get in this NDAA that is currently going. The first one is equitable caregiver leave. We feel that men and women should have the same amount of caregiver leave to have gender parity, which is separate than the medical leave. The construct that there's a primary, secondary parent is kind of outdated. And what we're finding in the anecdotal evidence is that a lot of commanders are denying males, especially, from trying to be the primary caregiver. So recently, if you go on to, I think, the portal, A1 just released some guidance there to say that men can designate themselves as primary. They don't need to be denied. And but we would like to just shore up that policy, but we have to change the law. And the second thing is the Cadet Act that Megan Biles and the WIT has been working on. The cadets currently, if you get pregnant, you have to give your child up for adoption in order to come back. We think that process is a little archaic because a lot of times you may have a child with another member and that relationship goes sideways and they surrender the right to that parent and they can't re-adopt them after. So instead of having them put up for adoption, kind of just like what we do now, have a care plan that they can go live with their parents or something like that, instead of giving up parental rights so they could act.
Any other questions in the room? Are there other questions from online?
We have a comment. We have a comment from online. I was asking if you wanted to speak on camera. But Ms. Jen Nash says that she said, thank you. I personally experienced several of the issues you worked on. I am 5'2", and I got a height waiver to be a pilot back in 2006. Thankfully, my CC in the Guard knew it was an option.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, the height waiver, it used to be not even what they have now. You used to have to go to each base and drive around the country and sit in the cockpit. So my personal story is I came in and got commissioned as a lieutenant into comm, which is what you have cyber now, and I cross-trained to become a pilot. I worked very hard, spent a lot of money getting my private license. And on the first day of pilot training, my physical came back because they make you take the extra physical just before you get there. And I was a half an inch too short. So they pulled me out of pilot training on the first day in class. And I had to drive around the country to C-17s in Charleston. I would drive to Little Rock and C-130s, and I go to Meridian, Mississippi and get a 135, and so on, until I finally was able to get into the KC-135. And I was a little bit shocked when I got to the Pentagon 15 years later that these height issues were still going on. I kept hearing the stories of, the limited aircraft, and how could this be possible 15 years later? So that's kind of an introspective hint of what you needed to deep dive even further. So, and I'm glad that you got, what airframe do you fly? Put it in the chat.
She flew C-130s.
Hey Jess, can I jump in?
Yes. Go for it.
Hi. So how do men become better allies for the WIT, for the initiatives at the DAF level, at the DoD level?
That's a great question. And it's one that I'm asked pretty often. I think sometimes men are intimidated to ask women questions or show up to the Women's Initiative team. We had a lot of people ask me, am I allowed to come to these meetings as a guy? Yes, you are. Please, we want you there. I encourage women to stop admiring the problems amongst each other and let our male counterparts know what the issues are, because they can't help, they want to help us. And so my advice to a male airman is sit down with your peers, your airmen, ask questions and just listen. Don't try to fix it, just listen to them. And then get involved in stuff like the Women's Initiative team. Let me tell you, the hair policy started with Tech Sergeant Lind, a male. He was one of the 5 on the team. It started with him. He was a tower controller. One of his airmen was crying because of hair loss and the pain, and he went to help her. And he went on this long journey for 5 years before he connected with the WIT. And that's why when we build momentum, we can kind of help you coach, even at the base level, if you want to get involved. Yes, come, and you can dial in to our meetings once a month. You can join our Facebook group. It's not where we share information, but most of the stuff is in the meetings the first Tuesday of every month. And you can go on the Air Force portal and go to the Women's Initiative team, and you can see all the initiatives we're working on. And you can reach out to those leaders. And if there's something we're not working on and you want to work on it, just put it down and pitch it to us, and we'll give you mentors, and we have the network to help you get to the right decision makers. So men, please join the WIT. Women, tell men your problems, and men listen.
We have another comment from Ms. Nash and then a question from a J.E. Purdy. So I'll read Ms. Nash's comment first. She says, yes, I had to go out to the C-130, I'm sorry, airplane to make sure I could reach everything. Luckily, it was guard, so I didn't have to travel and fit, quotation marks, with the 130. Ms. Purdy's answer, Ms. J.E. Purdy's question is, can you share more about best practices for gathering anecdotal feedback? I have heard you share previously, and I think it's a critical part of your success. The effectiveness of, quotation, informal data, use all the info you have, periods and intervals.
Hi, Yay. Nice to see you. Yeah, you got to gather stories. I think what's made it successful is social media, because we're able to reach out and tell each other stories. Because when I was first flying pregnant, I was the first female I've ever met that flew pregnant, like I saw, and I didn't have social media to find and connect with other women. So I often use the crowdsourcing to start getting some of the ideas of where the areas are. And then you could actually, once you start seeing those trends, like, hey, I couldn't fly during a pregnancy, my commander wouldn't let me. No one really pays attention because it's like there's one person that tried to fly pregnant. So you can go and do things like what I did. Here's an example. I went to ASIMS, which is a database that we put, and our flyers are in there when they're coded, when they can't fly, you can do a code for pregnancy. And I pulled the data from ASIMS, or I requested it, and found out we had 400 aviators that were pregnant every year that were instantly grounded. And most of them wanted to fly during a pregnancy during this waiver. So I was able to build a case of during a pilot crisis, when people are leaving, and if half these women want to fly half their pregnancy, how much manpower that would bring back to the force and preserve their foundational readiness. So you got to find tools like that. You got to find little threads to pull, and then find the data like ASIMS. You can also, there's forms you can reach to AFPC, there's forms you can reach to A1 to request data too. Like if you suspect there's something there and you want to confirm it. But again, when you get the data, question it. I don't know if that helps at all, but yeah, you just get really creative in finding the data. And I will tell you this, we do surveys on Facebook all the time to kind of get an idea. And although they're not official Air Force surveys, senior leaders are going to listen if you mention something like, I mentioned that 90% of flyers have confirmed during this Facebook, they're hiding their pregnancy in their first trimester at some point, one day or 10 days or 20 days, at some point they are. They might not acknowledge it as official data, but it catches their ear.
Have you worked any with other groups to bring together, say, a generic Air Force-wide, match the requirements of the job to whoever wants the job, and you don't have a generic applies to everybody job? So for instance, when I was stationed in Germany, civil engineer, I was assigned the first female plumber in the Air Force. I didn't have a problem with her being a plumber. I had a problem with her being 4'10" and couldn't lift her toolbox. She couldn't turn a valve. She couldn't lift a manhole cover. So 80% of the time when I sent her out on a job, I had to send somebody with her with enough strength to lift her mailbox, her toolbox for her. She also couldn't reach the pedals in the truck. And so it wasn't that she was a female, it was the requirements of the job were not being met by her size and strength. On the other hand, I had over the years, people who also didn't match regardless of male or female. And it just seemed to me like, okay, there's a lot of jobs in the Air Force that can be done by people with only one leg or one eye, or that are blind and using Braille. Match the requirements of the job with whoever wants the job, and don't just have arbitrary limits that restrict who can apply.
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on. There's a great book called Invisible Women. It investigates data bias in everyday world. This is not a DoD Air Force problem. We did not use women in most of the things that we designed in the world. For example, they talk about in the book that we did not design airbags with women in mind. So even though men get in more accidents than women, women are more likely to die and get seriously injured. Why is that? Because the airbag was not designed for women. The close proximity, because they have a shorter stature. Until 2011, that was not a requirement. So women's safety, because of engineering constraints, and not to mention, they don't even test it on pregnant women. So I'll just throw that out there, or dummies.
Hi, Jess. My name is Lori Rasmussen. I'm a retired Air Force Colonel pilot, mom of 3 kids. I know Jen Nash made the comment earlier. So first, it's a great opportunity to me to say thank you to you and the whole team, because what you do is life-changing, and it sounds like something so small. I'm not trying to be melodramatic, but it makes the the efforts that you have done to help retain talent, like you talked about. My husband, who is a fellow pilot, you never knew a ponytail was so important to your long-term career success. So kudos to you for that. My actual question is, so what is going on specifically with the height stuff? You made a good point. I got how legacy aircraft were designed in the past, so the height requirements, can't go back and rebuild those airplanes. But so has the AFI been changed? So height requirements, you don't even need an ETP? Because I was the chief of the guard, so if every ETP is getting approved, why even have an ETP?
Right, so you still have to have a mechanism. We looked at that. The problem was the mechanism in which we could keep on track what aircraft you were qualified for. As you cross-training went through your career, we didn't have that in place yet. So we did the 3-part. The immediate was rebrand the waiver. Number 2 was, do the enlisted portion. And the third thing was mandate that you design aircraft using the recruiting population. But to get to your question, you still need to have the measurements. So it's just a mechanism thing, because we have stovepipe systems, which medical might not talk to 19th Air Force, and then you go here. So we still have something that needs to catch it. And we looked into the ARM system to see if we could do something like that, but they were in the middle of changing it. So if anybody wants to volunteer and help them get their systems to talk to each other, you're right, we don't. And that was kind of how we changed the language to make it seem like it wasn't a waiver, so that you didn't self-eliminate. I don't know if that helps. And there's still some things that need to be worked on. For instance, they measure all these aircraft and they put it in a system called ASIMS, so that women and men don't have to travel around the country. And they put it into a computer. So when you go to one location and they do all the extra measurements and they put it in there, it pops out with a chart and tells you what you can and cannot fly. Sometimes there's errors in that. So it was intended to be more efficient, and it is. But people take it, like it's the official, absolutely thinking laser and precision. Humans can make error. And oftentimes when somebody is on kind of the yellow side, like the C-17, there's an individual right now, I'm not going to say his name, he's in pilot training. We need them to let them sit in the cockpit and actually check it. I talked to Jennifer Whitestone at the anthropometrics lab, and that is actually a more accurate assessment. But sometimes we don't let people do that. And I know the Air National Guard have had some issues because somebody has to accept risk and no one wants to accept risk. So we still have some work to do, but I think we put a big hole in it, and we really need to figure out that mechanism that we don't have to say exception to policy. Does that answer your question, Lori?
It does, it absolutely does, but one more follow-on question. So I just think of, because I dealt with training waivers all the time in my former job with the Guard Bureau. And it's something like you perfectly stated, so much of it depends on if you get lucky enough, if you have an informed or uninformed commander. So I know you said you rebranded the height waiver itself, but how do you get after that unconscious bias piece with some male commanders, for instance, who wouldn't even put their females, submit them for a waiver? What's been done on that piece? Because I could just see if you're a young, wannabe female pilot.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's automatic. So if you're processing through the academy, or you're processing now through, RTC, if you fall out of it, they're going to do the additional measurements and put you in the system.
Okay.
But I think we should talk offline, Lori, because there is some stuff we need to work on the Guard. Because there's some personalities there. I used to work at the Air National Guard Readiness Center, and there is some personalities there that whether they're going to push a waiver forward or not is still personality dependent. And I wasn't able to do a mechanism before I left. I was just brute force getting it through, and I'm actually helping somebody right now. So I would love to talk to you offline.
Okay, sounds great.
Okay, so we just had one comment, and it just says, thanks Jessica and the amazing team for continuing to work on all these issues. I appreciate your assistance with my challenges. I'm pregnant currently and definitely experience the struggles.
Oh, I remember your story. It was, it's definitely a challenge to start a family in the military, men and women, just with the stuff here. I'm sorry you had to go through that. So thank you.
One suggestion for your whole program, and that is right now the big buzzword in the Air Force is innovation. and we've got AFWERX and all these other things. Nobody ever goes and looks at HR. I mean, that's like telling people to, eat Brussels sprouts. But, I think what your team has done should be hosted, at least in part, at the AFWERX and the other innovation centers, because it is, in my mind, an innovation, and people need to be aware of it. And at least if it had some screen space on AFWERX and these other locations, people might be more aware of it and the implications that come out of it. Plus, I think what you all have done applies in other areas too. For instance, enlisted troops. In 30 years in uniform, I continually had to tell my enlisted troops that if they had a jerk of a colonel or somebody that was interfering with their job, wouldn't pay attention to what they asked or whatever, just to break the glass on my cage, and I would go take care of the colonel. I also see no reason that enlisted troops can't be pilots, especially of remotely piloted vehicles. There's a whole there's a whole category of limits on enlisted troops, where they're denigrated by a lot of the officer corps, and that's still true today. I mean, I've got 50 years of the Air Force, and that's one thing I haven't seen enough change in.
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, thank you for your service, and thank you for being an advocate. And you're right, these AFWERX challenges, the maternity flight suit came about with a young Captain Jones who saw that we were making some changes with flying in pregnancy and made a video and posted it on social media and that's how it got the attention of the WIT in the Pentagon to get that connection here. So I'm a big fan of these programs.
Just I have a question. I know what the WIT does, it really does focus on women's issues, and I know there's minority issues that involved as well. But I think to your point, Ms. Lori, the unconscious bias, and because a lot of things start and end in a commander's hands, right? And a lot of those times the commanders do not have direct oversight or even a check to say, hey, you need to take a second look at that. So I'm just wondering or curious if you have any thoughts on how there could be systems put into place to kind of check those unconscious biases, or to find ways so that people aren't stopped at that first level of no. Because oftentimes as young troops and even young officers, I know for me, in my own experience, I've been nervous sometimes to take it outside of the loop, right? Or to get the IG involved, or to even post it on social media about some of the issues that are being dealt with. So do you have any thoughts, or is your team working on anything for those issues? So
Let me see if I understand your question right about how do you get around being afraid to file a complaint or use the chain of command. Is that kind of that in the unconscious bias as well?
Yes, and maybe more toward the minority perspective, right? I've had different experiences, not only as a woman, but also as a Black woman officer. And so what you guys have done has been tremendous. But sometimes when issues have been brought up, it's like, oh, well, you're only one of X amount of people in the squadron. And so you're just really a squeaky wheel that's easier to be set no, and you just kind of go off into the corner. Just kind of hard to gain momentum and support to push issues across the board.
Yeah, I can only imagine what it's like to be a minority and a woman, or another underrepresented group combined with another one. So those are unique challenges. I don't think I have all the answers for you, but what advice I would give you is that make sure that when we do boards like the uniform board, we have representation, people that make decisions, hiring boards, not just, oh, check the box, you have one female or you have one African-American person, because often those people, the studies show, won't want to give their opinion if they're the only one of the likeness in the room. So I believe the uniform room didn't have enough minority representation for them to understand. The first time when we had the hair policy pitched with the WIT, we actually did include the bulk for this type of hair, but they didn't put it in there, and they had to go back and put it in there when they realized it, so that they adjusted it and did the right thing. Unconscious bias is difficult. I would recommend if they do unconscious bias training that includes all the protected classes, not just one or two. That would include like maternal bias. And I think we need more resources at the unit level. EO, they do take complaints and they do have conflict resolution, but they don't have somebody teaching commanders unconscious bias. So we all have it. I have it. I think they could use a little bit more manpower at the tactical level, not just at the the box, unconscious buying on a CBT or wait until you're at your commander's course. And by then you've been in 15 years. So I don't have all the answers, but there's a few places to start, but thank you for the question.
We had a person that is currently in Japan. It's 3 a.m. in Japan, but her topic has been addressed, so she doesn't want to speak.
Well, hi, Japan.
But, so you have fans in Japan.
What time is it over there right now?
3 a.m.
Oh my gosh, that's
amazing.
awesome. Well, I just, if there's no more questions, or I'll sit here for a little bit more, but I would encourage you, a couple of more things is that you're going to be told no a lot when you want to make change. And I encourage you to get past that no. Like General Brown says, you're going to get at least like 5 no's, hell no, no, and then go through the whole process until eventually they come around. So be prepared for that. And make sure that you don't do it alone, that you go with the team. They'll help you see parts of the argument you didn't see. And sometimes you just need them there to encourage you. And if you don't have a team, recruit people. When I needed experts, I am not the smartest person in the room. Jennifer Whitestone and Chris Dawson figured out the enlisted piece. I was just the talking piece. And I didn't design the maternity flight suit. It was Captain Jones. She sewed it together, put it on, modeled it, and made a video. And I was able to get her to Lieutenant Colonel Presco, who's in charge of those requirements in the Pentagon. So just keep pushing. Ask yourself, is it something you can handle at your base level? And if you can't, a lot of times people, when they go through that chain of command and they're told no, like Tech Sergeant Lind, well, why he was getting stuck was his squadron group and wing commander are not in charge of the hair policy. So it's great that he is socializing it with them. Maybe they can help him with connections, but there are places like the WIT, there's a DACOWITS, the Defense Advisory Committee within the service you can write to. There are many avenues to get feedback up to the command levels. So that's not going around the chain of command. It's just getting information through some, a proper channel up there. So keep looking. And there's other ones, there's health ones. There is other barrier analysis working groups. If you don't know, we have an LGBTQ working group now. We have Hispanic, we have African-American, all these people, they have someone at the headquarters level and you can volunteer and they can help your voice be heard.
Jess, will you tell us one more time what the places are that if people do want to get involved? You mentioned the Facebook private
Right, so
page.
you can go to the Facebook page, Women's Initiative Team. I'll ask you 3 questions so we can make sure you're not a troll. And because social media is so much fun. You can go to the Air Force portal and go for the Women's Initiative Team and see our LOEs in there. And those are our leads and all that kind of stuff in there. And then we have you can reach Aaliyah Nadeem, Nadeem. She is the chair. And you'll see her on the portal. You email her, she'll add you to our email distro. You can attend the meetings the first Tuesday of every month at 10 on East Coast. We usually have speakers. It's not necessarily we do the sausage making, but it's very inspiring to be together and give each other updates. And you can volunteer from there. We'll kind of lead you in.
And you might warn the people in leadership positions that they should not get rid of WIT because then the Air Force will be witless.
Well, it was super great to be here. Thank you. I'm not on the goal, I'm retired, but if you need to get a hold of me, I'm on Jessica Ruttenber at gmail.com. Always happy to help or lend an ear, or if you just want to vent, I'm here too. So,
Jess, thank you again so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
thank you.